Hi there. In this video, I want to run through my recommended approach for analyzing and optimizing campaigns on Google Ads. So first thing to note here is, in my opinion, Google Ads is much more of a set and forget type structure or type approach in comparison to something like Meta Ads. So generally speaking, I wouldn't recommend hyper analyzing Google performance on a day-to-day basis. Generally, I'd recommend kind of planning the changes that you're going to make and then make all of those changes, once a week, maybe twice a month, to ensure that all of those changes happen at the same time to prevent kind of resetting that learning phase on Google Ads consistently over time. If you could compare the two, I'd say Google is more like kind of a battleship where once it's moving and has momentum, it's kind of like a really strong, unstoppable force, and you don't really want to be messing with that. Whereas Meta, on the other hand, so Facebook and Instagram, is more of kind of like a speedboat. It can chop and change. You can make changes on a day-to-day basis, be very aggressive with those changes, etc., and not really disrupt performance much at all by making those frequent aggressive changes. So just an overall approach in terms of how to manage Google Ads as a platform in comparison to Meta. Now, the second thing to note is that if you've watched my video on how to analyze and optimize Meta campaigns, Google Ads is different in the following way. So on Meta, because it's a social media platform, we're essentially showing our ads to a group of people, an interested group of people, whereas Google Ads, we're essentially serving for very specific terms that users put into the search bar on Google. So if you could compare them, Meta is more like a shotgun approach where we're just spraying our message to a group of people, whereas Google is more of a sniper approach where we are hyper-focusing our advertising on specific terms and pinpointing those specific terms that we want to serve for with our ads. So in terms of optimizing Meta performance, I'd recommend focusing your primary metric on CPC, so cost per click, and driving that down as much as possible while maintaining traffic quality. And I've put a full video on my channel if you'd like to watch that. On Google, I'd recommend a different approach. I'd recommend primarily focusing on in-platform return on ad spend and in-platform CPA. Also, because Google is a very kind of bottom of funnel and direct response platform, the in-platform tracking on Google Ads is generally a lot more accurate than Meta Ads, because a lot of the time Google Ads is the final touch point for a user. They search for a product, they click on that product, and they buy that product on the store, whereas Meta Ads is more of a top of funnel approach where you kind of building brand awareness, making people aware of your product, etc. And therefore, because it's such a top of funnel platform, optimizing campaigns based off a CPA or ROAS figure is not the greatest approach, because it doesn't really reflect accurately because it's such a top of funnel platform. So just to summarize, on Google, I'd recommend focusing on ROAS/CPA together with spend allocation. So how much spend is actually getting spent or getting allocated to a specific campaign, and then using click-through rate and cost per click as kind of secondary metrics to optimize campaign or to optimize or analyze performance off. So diving into the individual campaign types, and again, this is the recommended Google structure that I'd recommend running for e-commerce brands. Created a separate video on that, link below if you'd like to watch that, but I want to tie this optimization process into this structure here. So firstly, from a performance max perspective, generally this is kind of the easiest to manage or optimize because this is a very low touch point campaign. You essentially set the campaign up and you have very few options in terms of being able to make edits or manually manage or optimize this campaign. It's a very set and forget structure. So to kind of start off with this approach, in terms of managing or optimizing it, I'd highly recommend focusing on what the ROAS is sitting on for that campaign, how much the campaign is actually spending, and then the target return on ad spend set on that campaign. So just for context, target return on ad spend is a bidding strategy or a way of setting the return on ad spend that you want the campaign to achieve. Now, to note that the campaign will always focus on and go for the highest return on ad spend possible. This is just a way of restricting spend through the campaign if it is not hitting your desired goal. So if, for example, you have a performance max and you want that to be sitting on, let's say, an 8 return on ad spend, you can set that TROAS to an 8. And if it doesn't predict that spending on a certain keyword will yield that 8 return on ad spend, it won't spend. So a key thing to watch out for here is setting your TROAS too high and therefore throttling overall campaign spend. The second thing I'd mention or I'd recommend keeping an eye on is the split across different channels in terms of spend allocation. So as mentioned before, in Performance Max, we have multiple different ad channels all within the same campaign. So shopping, search, display, discover, etc., video, etc. And essentially we allocate or insert all of those different assets. So shopping, products, search, headlines, images, etc. And the campaign can essentially spend on whatever it sees to yield the best return. Now, we also want to ensure that the campaign is actually allocating spend towards the highest performing channels. And to do that, the best way to kind of break down channel performance is through the breakdown or PMax breakdown script written by Mike Rhodes. So just to give a bit of context, this is what it looks like here. And you essentially install it into your script section in Google Ads. And what it does is it essentially pulls out all of your PMax data, which in Google Ads you have little visibility over in terms of where that spend's actually getting allocated. It pulls all of that PMax data out into a separate spreadsheet here. And if you open up the categories or campaigns section, you can see exactly how much spend is getting allocated to, let's say, branded or non-branded terms. So how much spend are we spending on people searching for your specific brand name? And I'll touch on this further in just a second. But more importantly, it breaks down how much spend is getting allocated to each channel. So as you can see here, what is this? 85% of our spend is getting, 85% of our spend is getting allocated to the shopping network, and then 95% of our conversions are coming from the shopping network, and then the same goes for video, display, search, etc. Now, if you see that a lot of spend is getting allocated to, let's say, display, and it's not yielding any return, then you may want to, make changes to your overall account structure to pull more spend out of display and rather focus that into the shopping network. And this just gives you visibility over where the campaign's allocating spend and how that spend is performing. So in this case here, obviously this is a super healthy Performance Max because most of that spend is going on to shopping, and obviously most of our conversions are coming from the shopping network. And just for reference, we're sitting on a 10 ROAS in terms of shopping network performance. Display, as you can see here, is a 0.9 return on ad spend, which is not great, but we're not spending a huge amount on display in comparison to shopping. So this is not really a concern in this scenario because it's highly likely that display is somewhat contributing to those shopping conversions anyway. So that was Performance Max. In terms of cold shopping, I'd highly recommend, again, primarily focusing on ROAS or CPA metrics within the campaign, as well as how much spend is getting allocated to certain product categories or certain individual products. And then from there, using cost per click and click-through rate just as secondary metrics in terms of monitoring engagement and overall, click cost from the campaign or ad group as a whole. Now, in terms of optimizing shopping campaign performance, this is a shopping campaign here, and we've got multiple ad groups broken down by product category within this campaign. Apologies, this is all blurred because this is obviously client info. Now, if let's say you have product category A and product category B that are spending within your campaign, and you want most of the spend to go through product category B as opposed to product category A, because let's say they are higher margin products or more expensive products that you want to be spending on, because obviously they'll yield more contribution margin on the back end. If you want to push more spend through, let's say, product category B, you can lower the TROAS set on product category B and increase the TROAS set on product category A. By increasing the TROAS set on product category A, you essentially restrict spend through that, and that spend therefore has to go through the lower ROAS set or TROAS set ad group, which is obviously product category B, and that's a good way of essentially pushing spend into different ad groups within a single campaign using that TROAS approach. Now, for this account, the spend is and conversions coming through the account, because it's a relatively small account, is too low to actually run that TROAS bidding strategy. So we're running it on max clicks, which is something I put in this section here. So I don't have that feature to show you in this specific example, but just to mention that if you still can't get control over how you're allocating spend between ad groups, you can just launch each specific product category into its own campaign. But ideally, you want to keep everything as consolidated as possible within the account, because generally generally speaking, the more data and the more spend you have flowing through fewer structures, the, again, more data you have flowing through that or each individual structure, and the faster the campaign will optimize. And as a result, generally the better it will perform. And then just like Performance Max up here, if you see that your shopping campaign is not spending its full budget, it's highly likely that you've set your target return on ad spend on the campaign too high. So try lowering that if that's the case. Obviously, if you want to restrict spend at the campaign level based on what return on ad spend you'd like the campaign to be sitting on, let's say your goal ROAS is a 5, and if the campaign can't achieve a 5, you actually don't want to spend any more budget, then you can obviously set that T ROAS at a 5. If the campaign predicts that that spend won't reach, or a specific allocation of spend won't reach a 5 ROAS, it simply won't spend that budget. And that's a way of kind of optimizing performance on cold shopping. Then brand search. The primary metric I'd recommend focusing on here for brand search is search impression share. So search impression share is what percentage of the available impressions, so what percentage of the available searches that you're eligible to serve for are you actually serving for. Now with brand search, obviously the goal is to essentially serve for as many possible impressions for our brand name as possible, because it's obviously our brand name and we want to ensure that we are serving for that at every possible opportunity to avoid competitors taking that high purchase intent traffic from us. So in a brand search example here, ideally you want to be going for a search impression share above 80%. Now this does depend on what type of term your brand name is. So for example, if your brand name is something like this brand here, so they are called petcollars.com.au, their brand name is pretty much pet collars. This is obviously a brand name, but it's also a cold keyword. So it's very difficult to get a high impression share on a brand name like this because it's also a generic keyword. So people searching for the generic version will kind of also be served your brand name, which is a bit of an awkward one. So in this case, expect a lower search impression share. But if you've got a brand name such as this here, Memo Bottle, for example, obviously a very unique name, and therefore there, won't be any other people, or sorry, there won't be any other, generic search terms that would be confused with this specific brand name. So in this scenario, you should expect a impression share of over 80%. And if it's not over 80%, then increase budget on brand search. And with a scenario like this, where you've got a very unique brand name, your cost per click should be very low. So sub 15 cents per click, as opposed to a more generic brand name like this, where your cost per click on brand search could be like $1.50. So in this scenario here, we've got essentially a scenario where this term or their brand name is relatively generic. That's why we're paying so much per click. And we've got a good impression share so far, considering that this is kind of a cold keyword as well. But ideally, we'd want that over 80%. And then in terms of optimizing branded shopping, obviously the last campaign on this list, this is also a very set and forget type structure. What I'd recommend doing is simply going into the search terms report and seeing how much the shopping campaign or the branded shopping campaign is spending on your branded terms. If it's spending all of its budget on the branded terms every day, you may want to increase the budget. If it's not, and it's kind of, pulling in other terms as well, which it then excludes in the negative keyword lists, more detail on exactly how to install and set that up in a separate video in the video description. But if it's essentially allocating quite a bit of its spend per day to cold keywords that it's then excluding, then potentially pull that budget down, just that you spend all of that budget on your own branded terms. Generally, this should be sitting at about $5, maybe $10 a day, but I don't see a need for too much more than that if you're a smaller e-commerce brand with not much branded traffic. If you're just starting out, it's simply not worth allocating that budget to branded shopping because the search volume will just be too little. Rather just let those branded searches get caught up in either shopping or Performance Max. Then just one thing I forgot to mention, if you need to know how to install the breakdown script for Performance Max, separate video linked in the video description. description as well. So that's everything I wanted to mention in this video. Again, just to mention that this is quite a tricky video to film because there's a lot more nuance with Google Ads than there is with Meta. So there's a lot that I didn't touch on in this video in terms of, potential levers you have to optimize your campaigns, different ways to improve ad performance, etc. But the goal of this video is to at least give a business owner a basic understanding of how this works and how to kind of take advantage of the 80% of optimization and not worry about, the 1% increases that could be made with a lot more time spent in the account. So this should hopefully cover, 70 to 80% of the value in terms of optimizing and kind of squeezing the juice out of Google Ads. But there is a lot more nuance to this. So overall, hope this was of value. Thanks again for your time and chat soon.